Today's video is about another used turntable, and it's near and dear to my heart, which are the Linn LP12s. We were a dealer for them for a number of years, and then separated from them after Audiophile Systems, which was the distributor, got pushed out of the way by Linn Direct. And so this table came into us, and for me to do an upgrade. And the upgrade, I'll start talking about that. The upgrade involved replacing the original Linn bearing system, which is easily found by the white collar, with something that was more current called the Circus, which is not as current now. And the process involves literally taking the entire turntable apart. So I offered to upgrade the table a lot further with a real power supply, the original power supply for an LP12 1985. And this was a virgin table. I haven't seen one for a long time with something this simple. It wasn't a Valhalla board or the new current one. And since I was going to at least get him upgraded further along than he was, I wound up being Gene Kranz on Apollo 13 with what else could go wrong. Because when you're trying to upgrade a real old Linn turntable to any sort of standard, you got to keep in mind that the table has changed dramatically over the years from the original assembly. So while I'm trying to upgrade it, let's say to a 2000 or a 2005 Linn turntable, the only parts available to me now, like the cross brace, is really engineered for what's being manufactured in 2022. And so this is where it all began. So what started out to be what I thought would be a 5 or 6 hour project, I now have approximately 25 hours into it. There is no way that I can charge a customer now for all of the labor that has been involved in this. And the truth of the matter is I didn't expect it, and it's been quite a learning curve for me. So we upgraded the sub-chassis. Now the sub-chassis came from a company known as StackAudio out of England, and they have a lot of number of kits for what they be their approach to doing it. The product quality is quite high. I'm not sure how it performs against a current Linn design. The Linn subchassis, for example, in the past, while the shape is the same, the actual surface area was meant to ring, and now the bearing is still in on this one. But on the old turntables, it was very common for the welds here to break, and so the table doesn't ring anymore. It sounds like a dead piece of meat, and that was always a problem. So we replaced a lot of these early on. The stack is equally as dead, but it's not from manufacturing defect, it's from intent. And I can't fully give my opinion on this because of what I'm going to talk about as I get further into this video. The parts provided by Stack were quite good. Here's a whole bag of, springs and grommets and all sorts of little joys that naturally had to be replaced. But when you're talking with an older Linn LP12, you're talking about things that were regular nuts held in place by nail polish, I suppose, and didn't have locking M nuts, didn't have all sorts of things. So I started getting into it, and the first thing I ran into was the fact that the bolts that they now use an entirely different nut system. So not only did I have to buy nuts, I had to, with the bolts, but I had to watch out what was going on. And the games from that point was a lot of fun. Now I'm going to stop for a second and go backwards, because you'll notice that the Linn LP12 is sitting on a jig. And when you're doing a proper setup for a Linn LP12, the jig itself, you have to make sure is level in all directions. before you then begin to check, make sure the Linn LP12 is balanced in both directions as well. If it's not, and you're trying to do this on a kitchen table and you're crawling underneath, because I've heard stories about that, there's no way you can get a Linn properly tuned. This is a complex machine. It's not for the bashful. And fortunately, I had the opportunity to go to Scotland, learn how these things were manufactured, went through training experiences with them. So I'm kind of one of the real rare birds that's still left around. It's also one of the reasons that, to be honest, I really enjoy representing Riga and the Pure Fidelity turntable. Let me show you the Pure Fidelity for a moment. The Pure Fidelity turntable does not have any suspension. There's no springs like the Riga. It's essentially dealing with vibrations in an entirely different way. And so the setup on this is much easier than a Linn LP12. And trust me, having worked on hundreds of LP12s, getting to work on a Pure Fidelity is a real joy. So now I'm back at the Linn LP12, and my first words of advice is, if you're looking to buy a Linn LP12 and you're trying to do it on a real tight budget and you're willing to buy an old turntable, well, if you're going to do it right, I'll be honest with you, just buy a new Linn LP12, because there's so many things that have gone on that trying to bring an older table up to current spec or somewhat spec is just labor intensive beyond belief, and it's truly not worth it. Now, let's get a little further into the turntable. And so we added an older power supply in here. We had to deal with the ground. Here's the stack. With the way that things were changed and the cost of the parts, I could not upgrade the arm board, which really was important, but not as important as the other things I had to do. And when I got into the cross bracing, I actually had to modify it here and there to get it to work right. Now, after all of these hours that I put into this turntable, and it's for a really lovely gentleman, the first thing we ran into was that the older motor made the typical older Linn washing machine sound on the motor. And what they used to use was a bearing cap that was had a plastic bearing and a spring in it, and it pressed against the bottom side of the motor. Well, the washing machine sound was essentially the spring running around in that bucket, and I've got one here. So it was adding just a lot of noise to what's going on. So, here's the little bucket. Here's the spring with, the captured little bearing on it. When we started running into these problems years ago, the first thing we had to do was put grease on this to keep that from spinning around. And then eventually we had to add super glue to keep the spring in place. And then eventually the best thing to do is just take the damn thing off and forget it, because you just drive yourself nuts. When you're talking much older Linn LP12s, the grommets themselves are stiff. They're not doing their job properly. Trying to tune with these things is a nightmare. Here you can see they've been on there so long, you can actually see the spring rings. And you have grommets at the top, you have grommets at the bottom, and these things are just so far out of spec that it's just whatever. So here's an old bolt. If you see a Linn LP12 with silver bolts, you can really tell what age you're going to be dealing with. And again, don't do it. It's a shame, because I really love the table. So after I did all of this work to get the whole suspension and everything reassembled, to get the new sub chassis in, the circus bearing, it came time to test the turntable. And one of the risks you run when you buy a used turntable is you don't know the whole package, and I'm afraid he didn't know the whole package either. And so when I went to test the turntable and I tuned the suspension, I had to monkey around with how the Tonearm lead is, because we're using an aftermarket tone arm that really wasn't thought into the design of how it was to be hung, so it didn't interfere with the tuning of the table. And having set it up, the first thing I ran into was I only had one channel. So it was, oh shit. So the first thing I have to do is I have to pull off the 5-pin DIN cable and start checking continuity to see whether I had a bad tone arm lead, and the continuity tested out fine. So it's like, okay, that's not the problem. So what's going on with the tone arm? So let me walk around and do this. With the Gray 707, you have a couple set screws, so you can do the VTA. And we're going to loosen them up, because right now it doesn't matter. And off comes the tone arm. Now, Gray 707s are the tone arms that Linn originally recommended use for their turntables, because they weren't making their own arms. And so now the question becomes, where's the problem? So we know that the cable is running continuity, so we have to get into the tone arm itself. And this is where the magic occurs, because I don't know whether this 35-year-old Grace F9 cartridge is dead or what's going on. And the first thing I get into is I start looking at these leads, because I want to make sure I've got continuity down the arm. And a careful inspection of the blue lead right there shows me that at one point that was broken, and Itchy and Scratchy soldered it back on, because that's not the quality that the Japanese did at this time. You can look at the green and silver, and you can see the precision and the care done to connect it up. So now I don't know whether I've got a problem here or not. It would appear that I had continuity, but do I have a bad cartridge? Well, the risk is, with the way that that blue lead was done, that if I dismount the cartridge, as I've written about and done some other videos, that I will never be able to get the stylus properly realigned, because if it's been used a lot, it'll have flat spots in the side. And one of my blogs, I think it was the second or third one on our website, which is audibleelegance.com, talks about the risk of buying used cartridges. So now I'm in this catch-22 of, if I pull the cartridge out to figure out what's going on with the leads, I can't properly remount the cartridge. And the owner, recognized that the older Grace cartridges had, a fair amount of value, but a dead one, it really doesn't. So I'm stuck. And if I pull this off, I can't remount the cartridge properly, and I know I'll probably break one of these leads. So I'm now into having to solder it myself. So this is the sort of risk you get into when you buy a used turntable, particularly a high-end one. This is fairly early, but not too early, because the serial number is 24,000. I last stopped selling Linn turntables when they were in the 60,000 range, and I'm sure they're much further along than that. So when you're thinking about buying a used turntable, and we did the earlier video about what you see in a picture and what you really get, well, this would have been pictured from the top side, and you would have had no idea of what's going on with the head shell lead and everything else. So the surprises, how should we say, but wait, there's more, never seem to stop. And I'm going to take care of this gentleman very nicely. A lot of it was my personal learning time, but honestly, I will never touch an older Linn LP12 of this vintage, because it's just too much work and it's not worth the effort. Enjoy it for what it is, I suppose, but you're not getting a current turntable by any stretch of the imagination. So before anybody gets any ideas in their head, I'll continue to service and support the Linn LP12s we've sold. But honestly, folks, I don't want you to bring in whatever you found on the internet to me to try to get it right, because, you know, I would just as soon pull out a 45 and put it to my head.